Hi, my name is Joy Axelson, and in this lecture of 1 Peter, we're going to be looking at the theme of suffering and how we can apply it to our lives. The overall theme in this book is suffering. Peter goes through this book and encourages the original reader that throughout their suffering that they can still trust in God and they can understand their new identity as God's chosen people, His royal priesthood. And because of this, they can understand that this earth is not their final home, that they can endure the present suffering because it's temporary and they have hope of eternal glory. Another major point in this book is that Peter's encouraging the original reader to live godly lives, to love one another, to be holy. They can do this because they have a new identity as believers, as God's chosen people, and because of the sanctification of the Holy Spirit in their lives. And they are to follow Jesus' example. So what type of suffering did they experience? Remember, we talked about this before in another lecture, but it was both verbal and physical abuse. In 1 Peter 1:6, again, they had various trials. Chapter 2, verse 12, they were being spoken evil of. In chapter 2, verse 18 through 20, the slaves were being mistreated and beaten. In chapter 3, verse 1, the wives were suffering under unbelieving husbands. In chapter 13, verse 14, they were experiencing fear and intimidation. And also in verse 14 and verse 16 of chapter 3 and chapter 4, verse 14, they were being slandered or insulted and hated because of their good behavior and because they did not participate in evil behavior like they used to. And in chapter 4, verse 1, they are suffering in the flesh. So how were the original readers to behave under this suffering and persecution? There are some principles that we can see from 1 Peter that we can learn from and also apply to our lives. We should keep an eternal perspective. You see this in 1 Peter 1:7, chapter 4, verse 13, chapter 5, verse 10. This is absolutely key in this book, that they need to have a realization that what they are suffering now is temporary and small in comparison to eternity and the glory of heaven. That even though what they're going through now is difficult and it's hard to press through, that they can endure if they put their eyes and their joys on Jesus and their hope in the future, in the second coming. We are to also follow the example of Jesus. 1 Peter 2, verse 21 through 22, chapter 3, verse 18, and chapter 4, verse 1. In Philippians, Paul mentions Jesus as the ultimate example of a servant, of humility and serving others. And Peter shows Jesus as the ultimate example for the original reader. And all that he suffered for them, that he endured suffering for the sake of others, and so can they. We are to respond in the opposite spirit. We see this in 1 Peter 2:23, chapter 3, verse 9, and chapter 4, verse 19, that Peter is concerned that the original reader not fight back in the same way that they're experiencing persecution, that they are to show humility and they are to show love. But they're not to fear. We see that in 1 Peter 3:6 and verse 14. You know, fear comes from a desire to not suffer immediate pain, or it comes from not a real true faith in God or trusting God, or even not having a real understanding of eternal perspective. So the original reader, they were to trust in God. They were to know at the end that He would save them and that He would restore and comfort and strengthen and establish them. We see that in 1 Peter 5:10, that they could rejoice and even have joy during suffering. In 1 Peter 3, 16, we see that we can keep a clear conscience and be ready to make a defense. That the original reader are to have short accounts, the meaning that they are to be obedient and repentant. Peter says that it's important to make a defense, that they can defend their reputation and beliefs with pride in the truth. 1 Peter 4:12 is, don't be surprised at suffering. They're not to be surprised or blown away that they are suffering for the gospel or that trials come. We are to expect them. Be prepared to deal with them. And do it through God's grace. At 1 Peter 2:6 and chapter 4 verse 16, they are not to be ashamed of suffering. Suffering is a normal part of Christianity. It was hard for them. They might have lost families, jobs, their reputations were perhaps destroyed or affected, but Peter says that suffering is part of Christianity. Don't be surprised by it. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 12, verse 15 and 18, and even chapter 3:11 and chapter 4 verse 19 talks about trusting God's goodness and keep on doing good. That suffering as a part of Christianity, that God strengthens and refines our faith through it. Believers have to trust in God and continue to be a good example for unbelievers. Peter challenged the original reader to continue in doing good even though they were being persecuted, and hope that non-believers will see their response, will receive their lifestyle, and will come to faith in Jesus. Think about this as you work through this book, especially when Peter repeatedly reminds them to be holy, and he gives them specific commandments of good behavior throughout this book. 1 Peter 5 verse 8 and 9, do spiritual warfare. Peter tells them to resist the enemy. They were to ask for God's discernment and to believe in Jesus' power over the enemy. In 1 Peter 5:9, that they're not alone in suffering. They are to remember that they're not alone, that there's people throughout the Roman Empire during this time that were also suffering persecution. And we have to remember that too, that we are not alone. There are many places in the world where Christians are suffering. And they're innocent a lot of times, but they're still suffering. But they need to remember that they're not alone. So we can keep these things in mind, that there are people all over the world suffering for Jesus. And many are suffering even more than what we are going through. But we need to remember that what we experience now is temporary, is only short in comparison with the light of eternity. That we can experience joy and comfort even in the midst of what we're going on. That God has not left us alone. That we are to live godly lives in love and as examples for others. And it's important that we have a defense of the hope that is in us. Thank you.